Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Helen Sullivan, and I have the very great privilege of being the Dean of the College of Asia and the Pacific here at the ANU. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose lands we live, work, and play, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and to all First Nations people who may be with us this evening. The CAP Professorial Lecture Series was established to honour and celebrate the outstanding achievements of our colleagues who've been recently promoted to Professor. Now, this is a bit of a break with tradition. We're going to be doing this for a couple of years, but it's long enough to be a tradition, because of course Kirsten was actually promoted to Professor. It's really not appropriate to say recently. Quite some time ago, but for one reason or another, we've only been able to pin her down for this evening. So this is a rather belated, but no less celebratory event for Professor Kirsten Ainley and her extraordinary contributions to research and teaching at the college. As most of you will know, but if you don't, I'm going to tell you that Kirsten is based in the Department of International Relations at the Corabell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs. She is a feminist scholar of international relations and works on gender and justice in conflict-affected states. Her research focuses on international policy and practice in military, legal, and development-focused interventions and the impacts of those interventions. Her lecture this evening will examine how post-conflict and climate reconstruction can deliver justice, equality, and transformative change through feminist approaches. Kirsten will speak, I think, for about 40 minutes, or really however long she wants to speak for. Tends to be the way it goes. And there will be time for Q&A, and then, of course, there will be some refreshments afterwards. So please do stay and join us for that. But before we get there, it is my very great pleasure to welcome Professor Kirsten Ainley to the lectern.
Thank you, Helen. I think the brief said 50 minutes. I'm not great at keeping to time, but I'll see what I can do. I might just speed up as we go. So before we start, I'd also like to add my acknowledgement. I'm on the presence of unceded Ngunnawal and Ngambri lands, and to pay my respects to First Nations elders, past, present, and emerging, to extend that respect to any Indigenous people who are here with us tonight. I'd also like to start with some thank yous. Thank you all very much for coming. I'll say that now in case you leave before the end. Ellen, thank you very much for the warm welcome and for hosting the lecture tonight. It's been quite a year at AAU. Thank you for leading us through it. I hope we're out the other side, but I feel very privileged to be part of a college with a dean who has worked tirelessly to defend students, to defend staff, and to defend academic values. So it's really quite meaningful to be doing this lecture tonight. And thank you to Tony Erskine, Professor Tony Erskine. I should use everybody's title, shouldn't I? It's good form. So Professor Helen Sullivan, Professor Tony Erskine. I'll give up after you two. He's director of the school when I arrived and responsible for bringing me to Canberra. He's also a very valued mentor and friend. Tony, it turned out to be a great decision to come because I've been able to work with a really phenomenal group of people here, colleagues and students in the department, the school, the college, sometimes even outside CAP, although they're not really up to our standards. The intellectual space that we co-create here in the college is really something, as are the acts of solidarity and resistance that I've participated in with many of you over the last year. I'm glad to be around so many union members. If I'm not a member of your union already, I do suggest you join up. Thank you also to Hatisa, to Cooper, to the CAP events team for organising and reorganising this lecture a number of times now in response to clashes. I also need to thank the people I research and write with. So I wrote my PhD in political philosophy, and I was asked once to contribute to a methods seminar. And I said, well, I haven't got anything to say because I just read books and think about stuff. When I finished my PhD, my methods changed they really did an about face. And most of the research that I've done in the last 10 or 15 years has been very collaborative and participatory. I think some might describe my method now as an inability to refuse a plane ticket and an insatiable love of chatting. This is probably true, but I've learned a lot from everybody that I've worked with. I'm not going to try and thank them all. That would take up all the 50 minutes. The last research project I finished, I wrote the report up with more than 100 people. But I'm grateful to everybody that I've worked with and learned from. I'm going to single out two people.
Nick Lemay-Hebert, formerly of this building, now the director of the Humanitarian Conflict Response Institute at Manchester University. Nick and Camilo Sanchez. So Nick and I set up the Architectures for Peace Lab in our department last year, and Nick was such a treat residing in the office next to me while he was here. He has a huge intellectual curiosity and energy, and I'm very grateful to him for coming up with the idea for the lab and for inviting me to join him in founding it, because I think it's underwritten some of the work that I'm going to talk to you about tonight and given me the courage to go down a different path, or to take a meander from the path I thought I was on. I'm also grateful to Camilo Sanchez, who gave the launch lecture for the lab in April this year, because he gave me the kindest and most comprehensive telling off I think I've ever had. I approached Camilo's organization, De Justicia in Colombia, 10 years ago to ask if they'd be interested to work on a project with me on justice and development. It was a terrible, terrible approach. I think I offered to evaluate the work they did from my highfalutin position as an academic. And rather than just ignore my email or tell me where to go, Camilo organized a phone call, and he talked to me about the fruitful ways in which academics can work with non-academic partners. And he has enabled, through listening to him, I hope, for the most part, me to get access to places and perspectives that I would never otherwise have got through work with civil society partners on some of the research that I've done. And finally, before I get to the lecture itself, I'd like to thank the people who bear the cost of my inability to turn down a plane ticket. I've had the privilege of parenting 3 beautiful boys, 2 of whom are here tonight. One's in London, being a lawyer. They made my life inordinately richer and more joyful. And my work has become more meaningful because I need to make sure I can justify it taking me away from them. They are low-key skibbity, all 3 of them. One of them did tell me tonight that I should be very nervous because my job depended on it. I'm not sure he entirely understands. Either he or I don't entirely understand the function of this lecture. So I'm also very grateful to their dad, who makes my life busier and more chaotic, like the boys, but with whom I've learned a lot about revolutionary change. Thank you all for getting me here tonight. Thank you for coming tonight. And thank you for putting me in the position, apparently, both to keep my job and to keep my children awake. So let me get on with the lecture. I'm going to tell you some stories tonight about justice. And I'm going to use a lot of pictures because it's the evening and we all need pictures to help stay interested. I'll give you a short content warning. There are some pictures of conflict, but there's nothing, I hope, that will be particularly upsetting, and they're just in the first few slides. But there are some pictures of destruction in cities. In telling you some stories about justice, I'd like to inspire you to think about the role of space and place within forms of justice, and maybe the role of space and place within your own work or your own context. So at the start of events here in the college, we acknowledge the land we're on. And in the college, we talk a lot about the Asia-Pacific region, about our region or our place. And tonight, I'm going to talk about some specific spaces and places and the idea of spatial and gender justice. And this is based on a project that I'm starting on called Constructing Gender Justice. So I'm going to take you from here, which is where we are, to Tibinbilla and the beautiful lands that we live on, through the devastation of conflict and to hopefully a gender-just future. This was the best I could find. It's quite difficult to find images of gender-just futures, which I think tells us quite a lot about this project. So just before I do, let me give you a quick bit of institutional background. This leads from the work that I do with Nick at the Architectures for Peace Lab. If you have any interest in the lecture tonight, please do join our reading group. I know some of you who are in the reading group are here. Thank you for coming. And have a look for our events. The lab supports intellectually rather than materially at the moment work on infrastructures and built environments, the impacts on peace and on military interventions. And it's part of a global peace labs network alongside that runs from the Carter School at George Mason University in Washington. That runs alongside other labs, including on peace engineering, but also on transitioning justice, which focuses on racially equitable and community-based restorative justice and peace and conflict resolution in carceral spaces. So the focus of that lab is on US communities, but of course it has very significant relevance to us here. So let's start here. Because Australia, the indigenous custodians of this beautiful stolen land that we're on, have a lot to teach us about how space and place matter. The land here has been sustaining me since I arrived in Australia, and I'm deeply grateful to the First Peoples who've taken care of it for tens of thousands of years. I recognise, and I don't know entirely what to do with, the fact that my presence on this land is still part of a story of settler colonial dispossession and of extraordinary levels of spatial injustice and harm. And I intend that this project in time can be developed to contribute to the phenomenal work that's already been being done by activists and academics on justice and Indigenous land in Australia. And the hard work of claiming spatial justice and rebuilding communities has been taking place on this land for a long time, including by sustaining the world's longest continuous protest for Indigenous land rights at the Old Parliament. So I will start, as one of my undergraduate philosophy tutors always told us that we must, now and around here. But now and around here in our politics, in our ethics, is also a war which threatens to, and perhaps already has, fatally undermined any kind of international society that could claim to be based around principles of justice. Now, I sometimes play a game with my students and ask them to guess what's in the images. And I'm not going to do that because I find this one so difficult to get my head around, but it felt quite important to start with these images. These are images of space and life in Gaza prior to the most recent war. And I include them not because it was paradise. It wasn't. Gaza was known as the world's largest open-air prison, but because people lived their lives in Gaza. They grew food, they studied. The top right is the Islamic University in Gaza, now destroyed. They worshipped, they went to parks, they went to beaches. Space sustained life, and the occupation could be resisted through placemaking practices, however constrained. And the ability of this place of Gaza to sustain life is now all but destroyed. And we know some of the statistics. I'll just repeat a couple here. In Gaza City alone, 83% of all structures are damaged. The International Commission of Inquiry on the Occupied Territories suggests that over 60,000 buildings have been totally destroyed in Gaza, over 20,000 severely damaged, over 56,000 moderately damaged. There are 50 million tons of debris created that would take 21 years to completely dispose of. This war has laid waste to every university and to 90% of the schools in Gaza, alongside the direct and indirect targeting of Gaza's healthcare facilities. And this is a picture of some of what is left. Now, does this destruction of place matter? Surely the destruction of people, the enormous number of lives lost, is where we should concentrate. And of course that matters. But I think that thinking about space and place matters too. Most obviously because they are our built environments, so the human constructed places where we live and we work and we play and we care for each other, are essential to meeting a range of our needs. And I'll come back to this towards the end of the talk, but there are human rights that can't be fulfilled except through a functioning infrastructure, the rights to food, to water, education, and so on. But destruction annihilates more than what sits on the land. It also targets our connection to place. And our connection to place isn't just a feature of Indigenous or religious ontologies. We all have it. There are places we belong to, the places that we feel belonging in, lands and seas that sustain us, cities we love, gardens our grandparents planted, public spaces we go to celebrate with many others, secret places we go to be alone. And you might want to conjure up an image or two now of the kind of places that sustain you. Now, the destruction of those places is significant not just because of the destruction of the services that they may provide you, but the destruction of home, the destruction of memory, the destruction of connection to land and place. What some architect like Amara Zeus would call a domicide, a destruction of all that home means. As Zeus writes on Syria, and of course Gaza isn't the only place in which war has laid waste to cities, war is increasingly urban, which brings new threats to space and to place. There's an urbanization of warfare, which you can see Mosul here in Iraq, Aleppo in Syria, a suburb of Kyiv in Ukraine, which are relatively recent wars, but also an older war, Bogside in Northern Ireland in the 1970s. So war is not new to cities. But it is, the destruction of cities is enabling a destruction of place more profound than anything that we have seen before. Now, I'm going to give you a quick aside on climate, because I did say I was going to speak about climate tonight, and then I decided as I was writing this lecture about an hour ago, that I wasn't going to include much discussion of climate. Climate is critically important in terms of spatial justice, but I definitely, noticing the time now, I definitely don't have time to talk about climate as well. I'm going to stick to talking about war, but there are huge implications for spatial and gender justice in the climate crisis, and enormously important work that's being done by organisations like Diva for Equality, who spoke here in this room a couple of nights ago, presenting on their 17 urgent demands of Pacific feminists defending a living planet. But the story I'm going to tell is about conflict and post-conflict justice. And after conflict, there's been an increasing effort to try war crimes. And I started my research on justice by going to war crimes trials. It's the old International Criminal Court, the new International Criminal Court, and the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia there. And I noticed lots of things as I actually went to trials rather than read about trials. And one of the things I started to become interested in was the spaces of international justice, the ad hocery of some of the courts. So the old International Criminal Court, one of the courtrooms was in a basketball court. It actually worked quite well for visibility, but some of those spaces were in a car park, some were in a basketball court. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda at the top is in a conference centre in Arusha. It's quite disconcerting that ECCC in Cambodia is, they rebordered the city. They rebordered Phnom Penh in order to say that this was a court that was in the city and to use military infrastructure for the buildings of the court. So I started as I was spending time at courts to see the ways that configurations of space would project grandeur or security or welcome. The way that the international imposition of justice impacted on local spaces. So on the right of the slide is the Special Court for Sierra Leone, which a low-income informal settlement in Freetown was cleared, and the court was gifted by international architects to Sierra Leone as a kind of beacon on a hill, or was often known as a spaceship. And it wasn't just odd, the Special Court for Sierra Leone, it was also indicative of a particular kind of international view of justice that took no regard for what people around it needed, really. So it cost, the trials at the Special Court for 13 indictees cost $250 million US. And the advantages of doing retributive justice would have had to be very, very high to justify that spend in Sierra Leone at the time, rather than spend on infrastructure and development, and they were not. So I started to think more about the meaning of justice and the limits of retributive justice. I worked on a project in 2017 that explicitly linked development and justice in the work that we did on the project, and took seriously different forms of justice demands that are made by parties and victim populations after conflict. And they might particularly include demand for various forms of spatial repair and for land rights, and not very often for retribution, as we might understand it. And got together with more collaborators on the Gender Justice and Security Hub, which introduced an explicit consideration of gender justice and the way that the Women, Peace and Security policy agenda impacts on some of the areas we were thinking about. And these projects gave, I think, quite a lot of interesting findings, at least for me, on space and place. A key one around land and land rights, which I hadn't thought a great deal about with my focus on war crimes trials, but are incredibly important to populations, and throw out all kinds of troubling links of what happens in and after conflict. So you'll see there's land there, palm oil plantations in Colombia, mining land outside Freetown in Sierra Leone, and some flooded land in Sri Lanka next to a piece of land that was claimed by the military. So lots of relationships between supposed development organisations, between military actors, between governments that take place within and actually often before, within and after conflict over land. We also saw through these projects the way that space can be used for protection. So the Women, Peace and Security pillar that gets most attention is one about protection of women and vulnerable or vulnerabilized populations. And sometimes statements are made in space to supposedly protect people, to protect women in this case. We've got installations of street lighting or safe toilets in refugee camps, all of which are incredibly important. but all of which are the provision of people who understand themselves to be doing charity work, not justice work, who are held to very few standards, often very low levels of accountability. And so while it felt like this was to do with justice, it wasn't understood as being, these weren't understood as provisions of justice by those who were impacted by them. So some of the more justicey uses of space I found in these projects were on memorialization. This is a documentation and memory centre in Gulu in northern Uganda, and a memorial hut in which the names of people who are missing in the Ugandan conflict are recorded. So the Ugandan government is not committed to memorialising the war, and they're in areas, the kind of work that's done by an organisation, this is a refugee law project, is necessarily reasonably minimal and has to be quite careful around the ways in which conflict is memorialised, because there are plenty of powerful actors who don't want it to be. There are places where memorialisation has become a state-level project, and a project of those with power. So the Yellow House in Beirut is a building that was very heavily sniped and, during the civil war in Lebanon in the 1980s, and was left standing as a testament to the conflict, and has recently been converted into a memory museum of the conflict to promote true recollection rather than conflict history being twisted. But it stands there in the centre of Beirut to remind people of the dangers of war. On the right is Fragmentos, which is an installation in Bogota, and the floor tiles there are melted down weapons of the FARC. This is an artist called Doris Salcido, who wanted to make a counter memorial to war, who wanted to show that we could rise above, effectively, conflict and weapons rather than be ruled by weapons. So there's really interesting stuff that can be done in memorialisation of space. So the last one is just a kind of declared intentions in space. I don't know if other people observe this, but there was a spate of sustainable development goals appearing everywhere. I think the kids' schools had sustainable development goals stickers on the stairs. There were blocks that would appear around. There's a kind of declaration of state intent around goals which can be seen in space. So we wrote up the report. I've got a summary of some of these reports here. This is the one that over 100 of us wrote, which was really quite fun to organise. And we came up with a whole bunch of conclusions about how to advance progress towards gender justice. And all of them are important, but none of them really address space. As I'm not going to talk through them, because I'm here to talk about space. So even among people who are working at the cutting edge of gender justice, it was difficult to imagine what a radical new future in which gender justice had been achieved would look like. Would there be streets and buildings? Would it look like the cities or the towns or the villages or the spaces that we live in now? And we spent quite a lot of time thinking about this and found it really difficult to imagine. But if you can't imagine a future, it's quite difficult to move towards it. So we gathered some very brilliant people. This is one of our spaces. This is the boardroom upstairs in this building. Some fantastic colleagues from around the college and the university and from around Australia came together to imagine radical futures. I know some of you were there, including the built environments. And we reimagined our built environment that day by having we made it into an art space, and people would draw and they would build things, as well as thinking about the ways in which the built environment and the future might look. And we came up with the importance of living peacefully with the environment, of course, of fair land rights, of working alongside Indigenous scholars and scholars of race and decolonisation and abolition who've been imagining radical futures for years. But it still didn't get quite as far as I was hoping to get on the built environment itself. So I went back to thinking about courts. This is the inside of the International Criminal Court, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and the Special Court for Sierra Leone. So I wanted to think conceptually about how space works and ways in which it might enable or frustrate transformative forms of gender justice, and the ways in which built environments might enable the full participation or flourishing of whole populations. And this is an example of how they don't. So, who would feel welcome here? who would perform at their best, who would feel that their needs are understood. Who and what are these spaces for? Well, they're not for the accused people, who often feel very deeply intimidated and often quite confused in these spaces. They're not really for their victims and witnesses, who also often feel unprotected, uncomfortable, and aren't able to speak and tell their stories in ways that they want to. They're not usually for defense lawyers, who have very small amounts of space. They're not for civil society or community groups who are told that they can't access these spaces, or if they do, they can only speak at certain times in certain ways. And they're not even for local prosecution lawyers or judges. They work very well for international judges and prosecution barristers, which should tell us something about why they don't deliver the kind of justice that post-conflict populations seek. And they're not just international spaces, they're often deeply gendered spaces. So I'll digress into something a little bit more personal to give another example. So think for a minute about spaces where you feel like you belong and are welcome and can speak, and perhaps some places that you don't, where you might feel silenced or like an imposter. So I ate most of my meals in this room for 3 years at a college in Oxford, and I did not belong. It was very clear to me when I arrived, I did not belong. And there were plenty of people there who felt that they did belong. Now, after 3 years, I got quite comfortable with it, and I did start to feel like I belong. But who would feel comfortable here in this space? Boys, this one's for you. Wizards feel comfortable, but not just wizards. This is Eton College's dining room, a public school, so a fee-paying, very grand fee-paying school in the UK. This is the dining room of one of the Inns of Court in the UK, where barristers have to eat a certain number of qualifying dinners to become a barrister and end up somewhere like the Special Court of Sierra Leone. And this is the Speaker's dining room in the UK Parliament. And we can find examples in many firms of their boardrooms, in many colonial buildings, of spaces that look like this, of spaces that people can move through and feel like they belong and feel like they can speak. Now, why do some spaces make us feel like we belong and some spaces silence us? Because our forms of structural relations are built into our spaces. Both patriarchy and other injustices are marked on the environment. So Ainley Robinson argues that our territory here is marked materially through dispossession and violence. Skyscrapers, shopping centres and museums are not indigenous. And everything you see, according to Robinson, is a statement of white possession. Now, where can we observe this in post-conflict environments outside Hogwarts? Well, we can observe it in the masculinization and securitization of certain spaces. These are post-conflict spaces in the north of Ireland. The Gendered City Project is very good at explaining the kind of things that we see here. So men or markers of masculinity often occupy public spaces in ways that assert forms of dominance, symbolically and physically. And this can include forms of territorial behavior, so men being more likely to claim and dominate communal areas like parks or streets or public transport. Exclusionary practices, women and marginalised genders are made to feel unwelcome or unsafe in some places. And that, of course, affects the gender dynamics of political movements and resistance movements, the places that people feel they can go and speak, the places that people gather to make political claims are safe for some and less safe and less welcome and less owned by others. When the state loses control of space, patriarchy often maintains that control. What also happens in space, and which gets to this slide, is a symbolism of power, of a glorification of militarization, a glorification of male leaders, of warriors, reinforcing narratives of male authority and protection in the public memory and in public space. And of course, the securitization and militarization of space can be even more stark. This is Israel's 700-kilometer border wall. And there are plenty of walls and divisions in cities around the world that mark space as safe or unsafe, as ours or theirs. But place-based silencing and injustice isn't the only issue here. There's also a failure among development actors who are apparently trying to help, but who too rarely listen to what people in communities, particularly marginalised communities and women, need, and fail to treat them as political and social agents in their own right. So 2 examples here. This is post-tsunami housing that was built and abandoned in Sri Lanka because it was built without consultation for the communities that needed it, and it was built as buildings that couldn't be used, without kitchens that could be used for family cooking. On the right is the Shatila refugee camp in Beirut, which previously housed Palestinian refugees over a very long period. And when I was there, it was housing Syrian refugees. So there was a lot of aid that was going into Shatila, but there was almost no work that was being done on the gendered relations in the refugee camp. So women were often not working for fear of harassment and abuse, were losing social status, and were being relegated to childcare and private space. So these are illustrations of the ways in which space can create or enforce injustice. But can it be used to achieve justice? Well, yes, because obviously we've got to have something quite sort of cheerful to say. So yes, it can. And we need, I think, to see spatial justice and gendered spatial justice within it as a key element of global ethics. So a just built environment is imperative to the achievement of many of our rights, as I mentioned earlier. And we can start to look at the ways in which that works by thinking not about urbanized conflicts, but about the way we live in cities. So David Harvey wrote about a right to the city in the 1970s. But while Harvey's work's really important here, his focus is on rights within the city much more than about space. And he doesn't actually talk about spatial justice particularly, he talks about territorial justice, and then only sparingly. So his work was later developed by Edward Soja, who develops the idea of spatial justice that requires a fair and equitable distribution of space and in space of socially valued resources and the opportunities to use them. He thinks about not just the city, but he thinks about space in local scales, in global scales. He also has interesting things to say about space itself, that space isn't just a kind of flat cartographic container of human activity, but is an active force that shapes human life. And Nancy Fraser and Iris Marion Young, 2 brilliant political philosophers, developed, not always consciously sort of working on gender spatial justice, but their ideas are used to build ideas of where does gender come into to spatial justice, and how is this active force that's shaping human life mapped out in concrete terms. And it appears in 3 forms. In forms of distributive justice, so the fair allocation of spatial resources, like all of the services that we use and are so rarely fairly distributed in any of the places that we live. The procedural form of justice, so the extent to which decision-making processes around spatial allocation are transparent and inclusive. And recognition, and this is particularly Nancy Fraser's idea of justice, is a really important one, which is the ways in which marginalised groups can take up public space and the ways in which they're represented within it. And where this kind of justice is achieved, we might see new forms of social and political agency emerge. The importance of this work on spatial justice is it's not just about the use of space, it's the way that space can create forms of agency and allow for forms of political agency and participation that some structures of space deny. So how might we see some of this in practice? To see procedural gender justice, we're going to just look to see who's involved in making decisions. And there's lots of good work that shows how women are excluded from decision-making spaces, but also how they exhibit forms of resistance and exhibit forms of political agency through the use of market spaces or beauty salons and so on. There are also some nice examples of the ways in which, there's nothing important behind that box, of the ways in which distributive justice can be achieved. So this is the High Line on the left in New York City, a space designed to be inclusive, quite revolutionary in its time, although of course we might want to think about who has the time to wander in New York City and whether that is genuinely a space which is available to all. There's also an urban garden with the red scaffolding designed by marginalised women in Beirut, the fabulous organisation called Design for Communities, who works to bring pieces of often abandoned space to make them available to communities and thinks about the politics of who designs, who builds, who runs through that. There's a community hut there at Mile 91 outside Freetown in Sierra Leone. This is a land rights training that was being run by Team Up for Justice, an organisation that spent a lot of time talking about land rights with women in Sierra Leone and finding ways to fund these kind of spaces that then get used for all kinds of other political and collective work too. And then at the bottom is the Colegio del Cuerpo, which is a dance school near Cartagena in Colombia, on a piece of land that was gifted by the mayor of Cartagena for a school that brings young people who are displaced by the war and others from marginalized areas together to what they talk about. They talk about healing the collective body of Colombia, to develop skills in young people, to develop forms of collective movement and collective agency that develop them political skills and economic skills. So some of the dancers who go through the college have become professional dancers, but many of them have become advocates for themselves because of the ways that they've engaged with each other and in nature in the dance school. There are also ways of expressing who public space is for in the form of recognitional justice. If anybody, is this going to close down? That's an ominous click I teach in this room, and that click often means that the system shuts down. Maybe I have to speed up. So these are forms, I'm actually not far from the end. These are forms of recognitional justice. How do people see themselves? Do they see themselves and the things they care about represented in space? These are examples in Colombia. If I'm doing anything that is ridiculous, if anyone knows how to get rid of this, please do tell me. I'm not proud. These are in Cartagena in Bogota and in Medellin in Colombia, which has a fabulous tradition of using public space to express collective values and to express often very significant forms of resistance to state power. And of course, it's not just in post-conflict societies. This is Sydney on the left and Delhi on the right, ways in which public space, again, can say, these are the things that we value and these are the things we speak. Do you mind? Thank you. But what route can we use to get here? So what I've shown you is some examples of communities and organizations, mostly in post-conflict sites, who work in creative ways, thank you, to build spaces of gender justice and spatial justice more broadly. But what of the bigger picture? What of the role of states? I'm in the international relations department. I'm particularly interested in uses of state power. States are perpetrators in conflicts and conflict actors. They're often also development actors. And what's the role of international law? So in the projects I'm going to go think about, we're back, by the way, in a masculinized wood-paneled space as the International Court of Justice. It's the first set of judges in the International Court of Justice in their dining room after the war. So I'm going to look at this project at a kind of four-part framework for thinking about the ways in which gender justice can be built after war, after climate disaster, and more broadly. The first is where we are now, which is Reconstruction. So Reconstruction is an act of profit-making or an act of charity that most governments and development actors engage in after conflict. There are few or no standards. There's very little accountability. These practices might be very deeply corrupt and very highly gendered. There's a couple of policy positions that give some chance of this improving the responsibility to rebuild, which was postulated as part of the responsibility to protect, and has, I think, been the most difficult of the elements of R2P to operationalize, in part because the way that responsibility to protect has been experienced by some populations is as an act of imperialism, and so sticking around to rebuild with the firms that you bring, the actors that you're going to profit from the rebuilding, is unlikely to be very popular. Nevertheless, there is at least some policy thinking around whether or not states outside a conflict site have a responsibility to populations within that site to rebuild after conflict rather than just to try and prevent atrocity crimes and violence in conflict. There's a pillar of women, peace and security, which is very useful to use to insist, the bigger policy agenda is very useful to use to insist on women's participation broadly. So UNSC Resolution 1325, which establishes women, peace and security, urges states to increase the participation of women, incorporate gender perspectives in all United Nations peace and security efforts. And the UN has repeatedly endorsed women's participation in transformative efforts, including in reimagining material environments. But again, the relief and recovery pillar has been the one which has had least work and has been hardest to enforce. But to move close to full circle, I'm also going to look at reparation. So reparation is one of the most progressive areas of international law and transitional justice. And various justice mechanisms are starting to engage with the destruction of material environments as internationally wrongful acts or as constitutive of international crimes, not least because the destruction in Gaza has highlighted how critical our environments are to sustain the conditions of life. So the ICJ has already indicated that reparation is owed by Israel to Gaza to restore that which it's destroyed or to compensate for the losses. And of course, this is a really complex field. And it's very difficult to know who would go where, under what legal regime, and to which courts to be able to claim reparation. But I've surprised myself by moving through the questioning of the boundaries of international justice to arrive back at the doors of international courts. So as this quote shows, the second one here, it's imperative that we do displace the idea of Reconstruction as a profit-making enterprise or as a form of charity. There are duties of justice for Reconstruction that material environments should provide for the conditions of human flourishing under international human rights law. So there are duties of reparation under international law that can be drawn on to demand that these obligations are fulfilled. And there's a lot that can be done with sustained and creative legal work here that give a very good chance, I think, to achieve genuine forms of gender justice in rebuilt environments. And if you will indulge me, I have just a couple of slides about the space of the university, given that we started now and around here, and I'd like to end now and around here. So the university space can be used to show what we stand for, what we value, and who's welcome. This is the Immersia Festival. The CHL Festival, I think that's this year's installation on the campus from this year. One of the scarred trees that Paul House has carved, and the Indigenous Diplomacy workshop that was held in this building a year and a half ago. And of course, university spaces can also be used as dangerous places, workplace health and safety aside. We are supposed to be here to resist power. Campus protests have played a critical role in our history. So I found this and I thought I would quite enjoy sharing it with you. You might already know about it, I didn't. This top picture on the left is 1974, is students occupying ANU's Chancellery building, in part to demand that a degree in women's studies was offered. I'm with them. There are other protests on the bushfires. Protests on bringing together, protests for various forms of racial justice. And perhaps one of my favorites is a guy in a Foucault t-shirt who is protesting a visit to ANU's campus of the Victorian Premier, Jeff Kennett, who was coming to speak to a Young Liberals function in 1993. And also last year, the Gaza Liberated Zone was set up on ANU's campus, which showed, often imperfectly, but nevertheless with great creativity and solidarity, how to use space to build forms of democratic social movements. And I'm grateful to our students for their taking of this space in our university. So thank you to ANU for seeing fit to promote me some time ago now to Professor. Being here in a college that values and rewards engaged research, that allows me to ask big, difficult questions, to work with big, difficult colleagues, to work with really excellent colleagues, and with those who are most affected by the issues that I research, and to take time to try and find answers, as well as to teach and to learn with some fantastic students. I'm very grateful to be a member of this college community, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you tonight.